Hello, and in this section of our unit, we're going to look at relationships. We looked yesterday at energy and how energy flows through an ecosystem. Now we're going to look at a few of the relationships that exist in an ecosystem. We're going to look at predation, mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism. And you've probably done these before, so this shouldn't be too hard for you, but let's just look at these a little more in depth. The most obvious relationship in a community is predation. That is where a predator species consumes a prey species. And right here is a little convention that represents whether this is favorable or unfavorable for each of the species involved, each of the populations. It is obviously very favorable, a plus, for the predator, and we have a minus sign because it is unfavorable for the prey. One thing to keep in mind, predation definitely moves energy and nutrients through food webs, and it also is important to understand that there can be competition involved, and that competition is an important force in natural selection. We have competition among the predators, those that are better adapted. They will capture and consume more prey and be more successful that way. There's also competition among the prey because those that have the best defenses, the most adaptive defenses against their predators are the ones that will survive. Let's also take a look at the competitive exclusion principle. Before we do that, we need to define a few terms. We need to define the term niche, which let's use a skinnier pencil for that definition. What is a niche? We learned yesterday that a niche is simply a combination of resources that a species is adapted to exploit. So it is all of its resources that it uses, it utilizes, it exploits for its own purpose. So having said that, how can we then define the competitive exclusion principle? Well, this should be pretty obvious. The competitive exclusion principle simply states that two species cannot occupy the same niche in the same ecosystem for very long because they will compete for the same resources in that niche, right? Up here, the species that competes the most successfully for those resources, whether it be food, space, anything else, it will eventually displace the competitor. So that being said, let's look at three more kinds of relationships that we find in ecosystems. The following three relationships are all symbiotic relationships. They are interactions between species that live together in relationships other than predator-prey, basically. So let's look at mutualism. That's the first one. Mutualism is where both species benefit. So here's our little symbol that we can use to describe mutualism. It's positive for one species, it's positive for the other. Both species benefit in this relationship. These are just all different examples. You can think of how these are showing benefits for both species in these pictures. One other example would be an example of a bean family plant and a bacterial organism called rhizobium. These bacteria live in the soil and they grow around the roots of the bean plant, and they are able to utilize the sugars, the carbohydrates that the bean plant creates during photosynthesis, so they benefit. In turn, the bacteria convert nitrogen gas into nitrogen compounds that the plant needs to use when it synthesizes amino acids. So the plant benefits from the rhizobium bacteria because of their activity in providing carbon compounds for them. So that's another example of a symbiotic relationship. two more types of symbiosis: parasitism and commensalism. Let's look at parasitism, and you all are pretty aware of this. A parasite, a relationship that a parasite has with its host, is definitely positive and negative. The parasite benefits, and the host, it is detrimental to the host. It does not benefit, it's harmed. There are a lot of different examples. I'm sure you can think of some really good examples to share in class. One of them would be mistletoe. It's a parasitic plant that does not root in soil. Instead, it grows into the xylem of a tree and draws water and dissolved soil and mineral nutrients from its host, and eventually killing the tree. Commensalism, another kind of symbiosis, is one in which, let's write this down here, we have one species benefiting, but the other is just neutral. It doesn't hurt or help the other species. And so true commensalism is actually very rare, because usually there might be a slight advantage or a slight disadvantage rather than one species being completely unaffected and it being completely neutral. One example of pretty close to commensalism relationship would be barnacles on whales. The barnacles attach to the whales and they benefit because they're carried to new environments. The whales aren't harmed necessarily, but the increase in drag and turbulence created by the barnacles on the whales does cost the whale the use of more energy. So that's fairly close to a commensalism type of relationship, but it isn't purely commensal. If you want advanced proficiency, this is a pretty short little section here. Do some research. See if you can find some examples of some of these different kinds of relationships in different ecological environments and see what you can come up with. Bring those in class and be excited to see what you know.